Welcome. This is for the Introduction to Economics course. We're looking at Chapter 3 today on market demand and supply. You'll remember from our first chapters that we're talking about economics as a social science. We're looking at how people make decisions, and demand for a product deals with the choices of buyers in terms of how much quantity of a product do they demand at different prices. So we're just looking at buyer behavior. When you hear that word demand, you might think of someone, in everyday language, you might think demand is a bad thing, that someone is being rude to you and demanding something. But this, uh, in economics, we're using it in a different way. We're using it in a way to refer to buyer behavior. And you and I are buyers, we are consumers, and this is what demand is referring to. Remember ceteris paribus? We learned about this in a previous chapter. This deals with everything else remaining the same. Everything else is equal. It's an assumption that we're only worrying about the variables at hand in our problem. We're not going to worry about something crazy happening. A hurricane comes and messes everything up. We have a drastic change in our income. When those things happen, it will drastically change our model. But for now, just to build a demand curve, we're going to keep that assumption in place. That your income, that your tastes, that everything else in the world is staying the same right now. We're just looking at the variables at hand. The law of demand says that there's an inverse relationship between the price of a product and the quantity. So inverse means that they're going in opposite directions. If a product gets really, really expensive, that means the price is increasing. That means the quantity that people want will go down. Remember, inverse means it's going in opposite directions. Or if something is on sale, if there's a shoe sale at Dillard's and the price of those shoes are 50% off, 60% off, then we would expect, according to the law of demand, that the quantity of shoes that buyers are willing to purchase starts to go up. So if there's a sale and prices are going down, the amount of shoes that buyers are willing to purchase is going up. That's what we mean by an inverse relationship dealing with the law of demand. So a demand curve is based off of that law, that inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. Don't let the word curve throw you off. That's just what we call it in economics. But in our class, in this class, a straight line is just fine. What we just said, if something's on sale, people will buy more of it. If something's really expensive, people will buy less of it. A line that represents that behavior is called a demand curve. And this line or curve is going to show how much of a product or service people are willing and able to buy at different prices. So they're going to have the actual money to be able to do it. They have to want to do it and actually be able to do it at different prices. So we're just going to pretend that a person, if faced with a DVD, if it was 20 bucks, they would buy 4. If it was on sale at 15 bucks, they would buy more. If it was 10 bucks, they would say, well, this is a great deal, I'll buy 10. And if they saw that it was only $5 per DVD, that they would buy 16. So let's plot this data. Price goes over here on the vertical axis and quantity goes over here on the horizontal axis. And we've just plotted that data. Remember, we said if there were 20 bucks each, this person would buy 4. Well, that's point A. if each DVD cost 15 bucks, they would buy 6, and so on. And if you connect all of the dots which represent their preferences of how much this person would buy at every single price, that's a demand curve. Notice that it is sloping downward, representing the law of demand. There's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. And also notice that on the vertical axis, this is price per item. And then over here on the horizontal axis, it's total quantity of DVDs that they bought. You just have to remember that. That's how we do it in economics. So it's price per item on the vertical axis, and then it's total on the horizontal axis. Remember, because of that law of demand, we've got this negative slope. It's going to go downward. The demand curve is going to go downward. At a lower price, people are able to afford more DVDs, more shoes, whatever we're talking about. Now, that was just one person's demand, right? And if we had surveyed everybody in the class, how many DVDs would you buy at these prices, or how many times would you go to the movies or rent something from a movie from Redbox? If we added up everybody's answers, so if a DVD rental was a DVD purchase, was $20. Well, the person in our example bought 4. You might buy 0. I might buy 1. So then, assuming that the 3 of us make up the market for DVDs, that would be 4 plus 0 plus 1. Market demand at $20 per DVD would be 25. And that would be the summation of the individual demand schedules in a market. And we could do that for $20, $15, $10, $5, and end up with this last market demand curve over here, which you can see is a little bit flatter, but still holds that inverse that shows that inverse relationship between price and quantity. It still has the same shape as any other demand curve for an individual or for the market. All right, make sure you start by this slide that you know the difference between a change in quantity demanded and a change in demand. When the price changes, we've got a change in quantity demanded. That's the terminology for it. There's no shift. We're just moving from point to point along one demand curve. And it can happen downwards or it can go upwards. You see a movement from point A to point B. So this person would buy, this is a large amount of people. So this is market demand here, obviously with millions of DVDs. So if a DVD was $15, it looks like market demand is 20 million DVDs. Now, if DVDs were on sale and they're $10 a piece now for a DVD, it looks like the total quantity that people would buy in the market is 30 million. So this is a change in price, and it is a movement from point A to point B along one stationary demand curve. The purple line didn't shift. We're just going from point A to point B, and the terminology for this is a change in quantity demanded. Remember, ceteris paribus, that was an assumption that everything stays the same. Well, now, when we introduce a variable other than price and quantity, so we've got a third variable now, ceteris paribus does not hold true anymore. It's violated. So now when we've got a third variable besides price and quantity involved, we've got a whole shift. So that purple line is going to move either to the right or to the left, and the terminology for that is a change in demand. That's a shift. So if it's not price that's changing, it's going to be something like preferences. It's going to be something like income. It's going to be something like, now people demand streaming services. They don't watch DVDs anymore. It's going to lead to a shift in the demand curve, and the terminology for that is an increase or decrease in demand. So here's our original demand curve. D1. Now we've got a new one. You can see it's shifted to the right. So we went from the dotted one to the solid purple one called D2. That's called a shift in demand. It's not price that caused this shift. It was not DVDs going on sale. Otherwise, we would have gone from point A. Do you remember on the one of the previous slides? We would have gone from dot to dot on the same D1 line. Let's say that this was a blockbuster movie and everybody went crazy. It was a new Star Wars movie and everybody went crazy for it. So it doesn't matter if this DVD is $20. The demand would have shifted to the right. It doesn't matter if it's $15. It doesn't matter if it's $10. If it's a popular item or people have a lot of money, the economy is booming, it's not because the DVD went on sale that people are buying more of it. They're just buying more across the board. That's when we get this second demand curve, this D2 line, where at every single price point, the whole curve has shifted to the right. So if it's something other than price, this is fancy terminology here, changes in non-price determinants. That means it wasn't on sale, produce a shift. If it was just the price, if something was, going from $15 to $10, then that makes a movement along the demand curve. There's some terminology that we've been using. Remember, shift is when we get an actual second demand curve. It can shift to the right. That's called an increase in demand. It can shift to the left. It could be a decrease in demand. So D1, what might be where we started out with price and quantity, and then let's say that streaming services became more popular, then we would go from D1 to D3. So what are some of these non-price determinants that can cause an actual shift? I've mentioned some of these before. Number of buyers, our tastes and preferences with something really popular, income, maybe the economy's booming, or maybe the economy's in a recession and people are losing their jobs. Expectations of buyers, what they think is going to happen in the future. And then last, the prices of related goods. So I gave an example earlier with streaming services. If you don't need that physical DVD anymore, but that's easy and you can watch it anytime from your device. So that's a related product that's new, and it changed what was going on, because before it was just DVDs that we were watching movies off of, and before that it was video cassette tapes, for those of you who remember those. All right, so going through that list, number of buyers might be from immigration, for example. It might be the Baylor students coming back in the fall when they were out of town over the summer. Can shift demand to the right or to the left. So in the fall, when all the Baylor students come back, it's not that NEFAs, Chatters, Buzzard-Billies, everybody, lowered their prices. No, it's that more people are in town, and that would shift the demand for restaurant meals to go to the right. Tastes and preferences. So I gave the example of a new Star Wars movie coming out. Well, then people want to watch that. That would cause a demand curve to shift to the right. Had nothing to do with the price. Let's say that people don't want Beanie Babies anymore, or people, because of COVID-19, don't want to travel anymore. They don't want to take the risk of getting on an airplane. Well, then demand for air travel would shift to the left. Income is something that can shift demand, and a fancy way of saying that is a non-price determinant of demand. And there are two words, two key terms that you've got to remember under income. One is normal goods. These are things like flat screen TVs, brand name clothing, going out to eat at Olive Garden. You want more of these when you have more money. That's called a normal good. So nice cars, laptops, you buy more of those, the demand curve shifts out to the right when you have more money. When you have less money, when you lose your job, you're not going to be going out to eat as much anymore. You're not going to be traveling as much anymore. You're not going to be buying fancy stuff as much. That's what a normal good is. Now, with inferior goods, this also goes under income. So these are things like ramen noodles or off-brand items, Hill Country Fare, HEB brand items. When you have more money, you buy less ramen noodles. You ride the bus less. You go to Goodwill and buy fewer of their. You don't go to Goodwill as much. So the demand for cheaper cuts of meat like ground beef is going to decrease when you have more money. If there's a decline in income, then it's going to be the opposite. So compare and contrast inferior and normal goods. Inferior goods, if there's a decline in income, then yes, we're going to be buying more ramen noodles. Yes, we're going to be riding the bus more. So it depends, right? The relationship between income and your demand for a product is going to depend on whether it's an inferior or normal good. And it's also going to depend on what your income is doing, if it's going to increase or decrease. So let's say that we get some inside information, we hear a news report that, oh, you better get your gas right now because next month gas is going to be $4 a gallon. Well, even if the price hasn't changed yet, you and I might say, well, we better go fill up our gas tanks right now. And that would be an expectation. That would be an example of an expectation of a future change that could impact our buying behavior today, and that would shift the demand curve out to the right or to the left. Prices of related goods. Under this category, there are two key terms, substitute and complementary goods. So let's talk about substitute goods. So this might be tea and coffee. This might be Dr. Pepper and Dr. Thunder, Coke and Pepsi, DVDs and streaming services that are online. Or Baylor and MCC, for example, let's say that a reduction in the price of Baylor tuition, now this wouldn't happen, but if Baylor decided to discount their tuition, that might decrease enough, that might draw some MCC students away and decrease the demand for MCC classes. On the other hand, an increase in the price of Baylor tuition causes an increase in the demand for MCC classes. So those are substitute goods. Complementary goods are things that Our examples for those are things that we might use together, but these are things in which there's an inverse relationship between the price of one product of good A and the demand for good B. So think of like peanut butter and jelly, for example. If peanut butter is really cheap and then people start buying more peanut butter, they might buy more jelly too, because those complement each other. On the other hand, if peanut butter gets super expensive for some reason and people don't eat as much peanut butter, that might decrease the demand for jelly. So don't get mixed up between substitute and complementary goods and how they impact, how the price of one impacts the demand for the other. Before we move on, I also want to point out that whenever we're looking at the demand curve for something, this is for one product. You might remember the production possibilities curve. We had computers on one side and pizza on the horizontal axis. We had two products. We were talking about Snickers and Starburst. Okay, this is a different model. This is a different graph. And each supply and demand graph, we're just looking at demand right now, but each one of these graphs deal with the price and quantity of one item. So Snickers gets its own graph. Starburst gets its own graph. Computers gets its own graph. Pizza gets its own graph. These graphs deal with just one item. All right, let's switch gears. We were thinking of ourselves as consumers. Now you've got to think about it from the supply side of businesses. The law of supply shows a direct relationship. That means they're moving in the same direction. The two variables that we're talking about are price of a good and the quantity. So if you're making t-shirts or if you are Chip and Joanna Gaines and people are wanting to buy and pay more at your Magnolia Market, all the stuff that you have there, you are happy to supply more of it, right? So a direct relationship means that these two variables are moving in the same direction. People are happy to pay more. The quantity that you're willing to offer for sale is also going to increase as well. Here's some data that we are going to plot and come up with a supply curve. So again, we've got price per DVD on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, and look, supply goes up. It shows that direct relationship between price and quantity. Remember, demand went down, but supply is going up. We can talk about one seller like Magnolia, or we can talk about the whole retail industry, or we can talk about all of the retailers here in Waco, Texas. So again, if we were to survey the whole market, so Magnolia, Target, Walmart, if people wanted to pay this much for home decor, how much would you supply in your store? And if they answered all of that, we add up all their responses, that's how we would come up with a market supply curve, but it would still have that same upward sloping shape. All right, remember we did this with demand. Change in quantity supplied versus a change in supply. So the longer one deals with the movement along the curve. And a change in supply, do you remember what a change in demand was? That was a shift. So this one's also a shift. When it's only the price that's changing, what's happening? Not a shift. We're just going from dot to dot on one single stationary supply curve, and the terminology for that is a change in quantity supplied. All right, let's take a look here. A change in the price causes a change in the quantity supplied. So if we were going to start here at $10 per DVD, and now it's $15. Well, consumers wouldn't like that very much, but if you were the producer of DVDs, you might say, hey, this is good news. It looks like people want this. I'm going to start making more DVDs. And that's how we get from point A to point B. Now remember, ceteris paribus is still in being upheld right now. Because why? That red line, that red supply curve has not shifted. This is not a shift. We're just looking at movement along the curve, and the terminology from moving from point A to point B is a change in quantity supply. What was the only thing that can cause this? A change in the price from $10 to $15. Once we violate ceteris paribus, so it's not just price or quantity that we're looking at anymore. It's not just those two variables. If we add in a third variable, so something else has changed, all else is not equal, that's when we get a shift. That's when we call it a change in supply. And let's take a look here. So if we started out with this dotted line, supply 1, and something happens, it's going to be besides price, and we get to supply 2, S2, that's the solid red line. That means at every single price level, $15, $10, $5, we're now supplying more. So something has happened. Maybe we got more workers. Maybe we got more machinery. Maybe we got better machinery. Maybe we have expectations for higher sales. Maybe our show, Fixer Upper, goes on TV and everybody, it's really popular and people want our stuff and we expect higher sales from that. That can cause a shift of supply to the right. So it has to be something other than price causing a shift, like more workers, more technology, for example. And a shift means a whole new supply curve. Right? This is an exhibit that summarizes what we were just talking about. Remember, a shift can be to the right, that's called an increased supply, or it can shift to the left, and that's called a decrease in supply. What can shifts be caused by? Remember, these are non-price, so it's not the price that causes a change. Maybe we have more sellers. Maybe we have more technology. Maybe a resource price has changed. So if we're making t-shirts and the price of cotton goes up, you know, that's one of our resources. Remember, one of our inputs. Then that's bad news, right? If we're making pencils and the price of wood, there's a lumber shortage, the price of wood goes up, that's going to hurt us, right? That's going to be a leftward shift, a decrease in supply. If we are a bakery and sugar, let's say sugar got really cheap. There was an abundant supply of sugar in the market for some reason. So sugar is really cheap for us. That's going to be positive impact on our company. So that would be a supply shift to the right. So those are some examples of resource prices changing. Taxes and subsidies. So obviously a tax break would cause supply to shift to the right. That would be a positive thing. Or higher taxes would cause supply to shift to the left. Subsidy is something that the government pays for. So if it was a really hard year for farmers, for example, and the government pays a subsidy to help with some of the loss of the crops, then that might help shift supply of crops up to the right. Also, expectations of producers. If you and I produce something at our company that's school supplies, we're going to expect higher sales and therefore ramp up supply, right before August. We're going to have those expectations, just like consumers do, and then also prices of other products that the firm could produce. So all of these things are examples of when we violate ceteris paribus, and these are things that can shift supply, not cause a movement from dot to dot. All right. These are other examples I've just gone through and talked about examples. Number of sellers can shift supply either to the right or to the left. Technology can shift supply to the right or to the left. Resource prices. I gave the example of sugar for your cakes in a bakery, or lead or wood that you would need for your pencil. It's important to know examples of these because you're going to have a problem and it's just going to give an example and you'll have to identify and think back, was this on the list of some things that can shift supply or demand? And then you'll be able to go on and solve the problem. So that's why it's important to go through these examples. Taxes and subsidies can shift supply to the right or to the left. Expectations can shift supply to the right or to the left. Expectations is on the supply list and the demand list too, things that can shift supply and demand. Prices of other goods and services. I've used this word market before, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page, a market is a group of buyers and sellers, or it can be an arrangement, it can be online, it can be face-to-face. So any type of situation where we have buyers and sellers interacting, the price is the main signal in a market. Equilibrium is the price at which supply and demand meet, and it's where quantity demanded and quantity supplied are equal. And here they are. We've talked about demand, the law of demand, and that's why demand is downward sloping. We've talked about the law of supply, and that's why it's upward sloping. It's that red line. Equilibrium is right where they meet. So here, where our product is sneakers, it's shoes. Remember, every supply and demand curve, we've got just one product. So if we were talking about socks, that's a separate graph. This is just sneakers on this graph. If they are $60 per pair of shoes in this market, 50, the equilibrium quantity is 50. That's where the market clears. That's where there are no shortages and no surpluses. And that'll be really important to identify where equilibrium is. So $60 is perfect. $90 would be too expensive. We'd have a surplus. $30 would be too cheap. We would have a shortage. And we are going to get to that in the next chapter. But we want to be at equilibrium. That's where the market clears. There's no extra, there's no waiting list because there's a shortage of items. So economists really, really like equilibrium, and that's where the market clears. All right, thank you. So hopefully that'll be enough, and I'll post additional videos to help you with drawing out supply and demand. I remember taking my first economics class, I came up with a little saying. I would draw my axes here, and then I would write a P over here for price, S for your supply, D, and Q for quantity. And the way I remembered how to label everything was please, Sally, don't quit. So if that helps you use it, you don't want to get price and quantity mixed up. You don't want to get supply and demand mixed up. If you can label your graph correctly, you've got half of your problem solved when it comes to supply and demand. And then we'll have practice with the the shifting of supply or demand, but you've got to be able to label it correctly to begin with. All right, we will continue in chapter 4 next. Thank you.